Hey guys, welcome to HIPHUGHES History, World History Edition. We're going to go get ourselves some Viking history today and find out what you need to know about these northern Scandinavian peoples that wreaked a little bit of havoc in the Dark Ages for 200 or 300 years. So whether you're a kid in school or you're a lifelong learner or cray-cray on the internet, I don't care. I just want to giddy up for the learning. Let's go get her done. All right, guys, let's travel back to the Dark Ages and first start with the idea that there is no Viking land. All right, it's not a united civilization where we can talk about like the Roman Empire, the Viking Empire. There certainly is going to be some commonalities in the way that these peoples live, but they're never really united under one banner of Vikinghood or something like that. Now, if we're talking about geography, we're talking about a very cold place in what today is known as the Scandinavian countries. So Vikings lived in countries today that would be Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and certainly the time frame is hard to put years on because there's no united empire. But certainly if we're talking about the heyday of the Vikings, where they're really going to wreak some havoc on Europe and the world with their seafaring skills, we're talking about the late 8th century to the early 11th century. Now, how do we know what we know about Vikings? Some of it comes from mythology, but there is some writings, the Norse sagas written in the 12th century, that give us some insight into how they lived their daily lives, what their religious practices were. But we also know a lot from archaeologists who have dug up some of these settlements and these areas where they've lived that do give us some insight into how they live. So let's take a look at how a Viking lived. So let's first start with the idea that if you're a Viking, you're probably not living on a boat with a helmet with horns, right? Most people aren't Vikings in that sense. Some were. None of them had horns on their helmets, though. That's ridiculous. If you had horns on your helmet, you'd poke the guy's eye out next to you. Most people are living the very hard life of survival in these Scandinavian coastal towns, living off the land. It's rocky, it's not easy to grow food, there's a short growing season, they're breeding animals, they're fishing, they're living a very hard life in independent villages that aren't united. Eventually, that lack of resource is going to kind of allow them to unite to really take advantage of their technological skills in boat making, and then they're going to be able to expand and go plunder and go get stuff. But for the most part, people are living a very hard life. Now, in terms of culture, they certainly had time for fun. They had a lot of fun with skiing and mountain climbing. They also invented some form of chess and a form of hockey. And women had more rights in Viking culture than they did certainly in European culture at that time. They were allowed to divorce their husbands, inherit property, and in a sense they were sort of equal with men, even though they couldn't pick their husbands, and they think they got married at the age of 12. Creepy, but we're not going to talk about that. Now, in terms of religion, not a united religion. We're going to call it Norse paganism, where this is pre-Christianity. Christianity is going to come around the year 1000, but they are, chieftain-based. They have their own rituals and customs. You've heard of some gods like Thor, the god of thunder. I think that's what Thursday is named after. But there's hundreds of gods and goddesses in Viking culture. And certainly they had their own festivities, they had sacrifices, they had different ways of honoring their gods and goddesses. They believed sometimes in ancestral worship. They had very elaborate burial procedures. And if you were high in culture, you were even buried on one of the boats. And sometimes they'd even sacrifice your slaves to be buried with you. That would really be bad. Imagine being a slave, it's bad enough, then your master dies, someone kills you so you could be buried with them. Oh my goodness. But certainly they had their own intricate cultural customs, village to village, under this banner of Norse paganism. They also had a very rigid structure of class system. There's ancient Norse mythology that talks about the god of Rig and how he was walking along the coast, and first he came to a hut and he ended up sleeping between the wife and the husband. 9 months later, the wife gets pregnant, gives birth to a social class known as the thralls. The thralls are supposed to be the slaves of society, and Viking culture had slavery. You could be born into slavery, or you could be captured as bounty. And they engaged heavily in the slave trade across the world, with the Arab world, with what was the developing Russian world, in Europe, in northern Africa. So then I guess the god Rig kept going. He came to a modest-looking house, got tired, slept between the wife and the husband, and then the wife got pregnant 9 months later, and she gave birth to the second-class system, which is known as Carls. These were freedmen. And there was some forms of democracy. They have meetings that were called the Thing. How cool is that? where they sort of made community-based decisions. And then I guess the god Rig got tired, went to another nice place, slept between the man and the woman. The woman got pregnant 9 months later. She gave birth to the Jarls, which are kind of the royalty in Viking culture. And Viking culture really put a lot of emphasis on precious metals, especially silver and gold. And they carried weights wherever they went. And they were really, at the end of the day, as much as we're going to talk about plundering, they were tradespeople. They were very interested in gaining more resources so they could live happier and healthier lives. All right, so we talked a little bit about their culture, a little bit about their religious beliefs, about the way they lived. Now let's see if we can invent some boats and go plunder the world. So in the late 8th century, there's a huge increase in the amount of civil wars between Viking communities due to the lack of resources. So they're going to start looking outward into the water. And that, matched with their awesome seafaring technological skills, is going to give them the ability to do that. And that's based in the Viking longship, a revolutionary seacraft machine that's going to outbeat everybody in the world. Everybody in the world at that time period had boats that were coastal, that you could only travel around on coastal areas. But this Viking longship is going to give them the ability to not only navigate rivers and coasts, but the deep ocean as well. These were swift machines, low draft. They could travel in shallow water. They weren't just coastal, they could be carried across land. It only took them 6 weeks to make one of these puppies. It could travel over 150 miles a day, and it could carry 60 men. So this is going to give them the ability to do what you know Vikings do really well, which is plunder. And now it would be the most masculine group of men, these Norse soldiers with their weapons of war, battle axes, swords, and knives, armor, and their cool helmets without the horns, and they jump on the boat and they'd go find some awesome resources. This first occurred in June of 793 in Lindisfarne, which is an island off northeast England, which was occupied by monks, and monks offer 2 awesome characteristics for plunderers. They have a lot of stuff, a lot of religious artifacts and silver and gold and awesome stuff. And they also don't fight back. And that's what Vikings did. They would take advantage of vulnerable populations. They landed on Lindisfarne and they wreaked havoc. They killed, they murdered, they stole. And when they brought the bounty back to those Scandinavian countries, people were like, oh my goodness, that's awesome. I want to do that as well. And that's what Vikings started to do. That's when it's going to explode, really in the mid-9th century, where Vikings are going to take advantage of these longships and they're going to look towards Europe. They're traveling across the Baltic Sea and they're finding pathways into Europe which are going to allow invasion. In 845, the Viking king Ragnar is going to find his way into France through the Seine and the Loire rivers. Some of them are going to actually stay behind, and that's going to be the Norman population, and eventually the Normans are going to conquer England. It was William the Conqueror, and he's the grandson of a Viking king. But this is how they make their way into Europe, into Paris, along these rivers, plundering and killing and taking the booty. It got so bad that Charles the Bald offered 6 tons of silver to the Vikings just to stop. So he gave him 6 tons of silver, and then all the other Vikings were like, 6 tons of silver? That's a lot of silver. Let's go plunder some more. So that didn't work. So Vikings are wreaking havoc during these dark ages for a 200 or 300 year time period on these Christian communities, taking all their great stuff and bringing it back to the Scandinavian countries, and that's going to make them expert tradesmen, because a silver cross doesn't do you very well unless you trade it for something even better. So they're taking their silver, they're taking their gold, they're taking their men, they're taking their women, they're taking their children for the slave market, and they're doing really good at it. Some Vikings were even too terrible for even the other Vikings. One of those Vikings in the late 900s was called Eric the Red. Eric the Red was exiled. They kicked him out of Iceland and Denmark. They said, we don't want you. You're too bad. You're bad to the bone. So Eric the Red got on his ship and he sailed across the ocean blue and he landed in what today is called Greenland, which shouldn't be called Greenland because it's a big rock of ice. Eric the Red actually named it Greenland in order to attract settlers to come. And when they came, they found a very harsh existence in this land known as Greenland. And eventually his son, Leif Erikson, is going to go even farther west with stories that there's land to the west, and he's going to land in Newfoundland. That's right, North America. Take that, Christopher Columbus. And for about a decade, Leif Erikson had a colony in Newfoundland, maybe even farther south and to the west of Newfoundland into North America. But eventually he's going to come back to Europe, actually as a Christian, to try to unite the Vikings, which isn't going to work really well. One word you might know that comes out of Viking language is the word berserk. It was the name berserk that was given to the berserkers who were invading, and they were said to be so crazy, either maybe they were drunk or on hallucinogenic mushrooms or something, that they would go into the state of craziness as they invaded, and that's where the word berserk comes from. So one of the last Viking kings is going to be Harald Hardrada, who's going to be king of Norway. He was actually exiled for a long time. He was part of the royal family in 1047. He came back to co-rule with his nephew, who then suspiciously died, and King Harald became the king of Norway. He's going to make one last venture for the Vikings into Europe and try to create an empire, a Viking empire, and he invades England in 1066. It's called the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And he was really cocky, he was really good at what he did, killing, but he was outmaneuvered and he was outnumbered by the English, who eventually defeat him. And that's really going to be the last hurrah for the Vikings. And interestingly enough, in 1066, when the English defeat the Norwegian Vikings, is the same year that they're defeated by the Normans at the Battle of Hastings. And then to make it more ironic, it's actually William the Conqueror, and he is the grandson of a Viking. So how about that? At the end of the day, it's the Vikings that are going to rule England. So for over 300 years, Viking culture had a huge impact on Europe. Really, their plundering and the terrorism that they put into the Dark Ages is unmarked in world history, and certainly their mad seafaring technological skills have an impact on their world, and they really created a larger economy at the end of the day. They are, in a sense, the wheel of trade during the Dark Ages, connecting the Far East with North Africa, with Europe and the Scandinavian countries. But at the end of the day, it's going to be assimilation and Christianity that's going to put an end to any dream of a Viking empire. So giddy up for the learning, guys. We hope you understand something about the Vikings. If anything now, you know they don't have horns on their helmet. How about that? So make sure that you check out other lectures, and I say it at the end of every lecture because I mean it with all of my heart. Where attention goes, energy flows.